This time on Poll Hub, we call it ASFLO. Nope, it's not one of those pharmaceuticals they advertise on cable news, but AS, Arizona, FLA, Florida, and O, Ohio. Well, that's a trio of battleground states that we survey with NBC News. And ASFLO has landed. New numbers paint a mixed picture for both parties as the midterms loom. We're going to look behind some of those numbers to see who and what's driving things, and then we're going to talk about all this with NBC's mad jumbotron genius, I hope I can call you that, Steve Kornacki. He's also written a book, wondering where he finds the time to do that. It's all about the 90s and how that decade of Clinton, Gingrich, OJ, and lots of folks there, and others shaped the politics of today. Yeah, he talks fast, but we've got a lot to cover, so we better get going. And hi, everybody. This is Poll Hub. I'm J.D. Dapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Barbara Carvalho, Director of the Marist Poll.
And I'm Lee Mergoff, Director of the Marist College Institute for Public Opinion. I say that like the Ohio State University. I just want you to know that.
Which is part of ASFLO.
Yes, that's true.
Ohio.
It works today. It does work. Finally.
So we're talking about ASFLO, and that's Arizona, Florida, and Ohio. We actually do a bunch of different battleground states. We just happen to have this trio together, and so we've given it a snappy name. Much tougher when we had Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. It was Miwimo and just never really worked.
And I think we have Nevada, Minnesota, and Wisconsin coming up. And
that's not going to work.
But ASFLO
Let's stay with this one.
ASFLO is great. Let's start with Florida, because Florida is a state I think that an awful lot of eyes are on, not only because it's been a decider in a couple of elections, but there's two big races there, governor's races.
Yeah, and I think also we're going to be talking to Steve Kornacki in a few moments, and the end of his book is about the election in 2000, when Florida, as you were there covering it, sort of played an important role.
Me and my hanging chads.
Yes, and Florida hasn't sort of gone off the map since, and right now it's a huge state as we go to the midterm elections, not only for Senate but for governor. We have two really important races. Our latest poll has incumbent Democrat Bill Nelson for Senate at 48, Governor Rick Scott, who's running for the Senate, at 45, technically within the margin of error, but a slight edge if you want to label it something.
And that's certainly one the Democrats need to hold on to.
Yeah, I was going to talk about that in one second. Governor Andrew Gillum at 48, Ron DeSantis at 43. And I might say this is pretty much tracking with what other, decent-looking polls have been showing. So it looks like a slight advantage for the Democrats in these races. And then Barb mentioned about the Senate race. And, this is one the Democrats hold currently. And if there's any chance of them getting the majority in the Senate, then they certainly are going to have to hold on to this. And it's a very competitive race.
And they've got to hold Ohio, too. There's a Senate seat there. A little bit different situation there.
Yeah, actually kind of surprising, because the thing about Ohio was a state that Trump won by more than 8 points just 2 years ago. And right now, 52% of Ohio voters want their midterm vote to send a message that more Democrats are needed to be a check on the power of the president. So when we take a look at the Senate race, we see Democrat incumbent Sherrod Brown running for a third term. He has a strong lead, 49% to 35% for his Republican opponent, Jim Renacci, who's a congressman from the class of 2010. So the Democrats, again, obviously have to hold the seat if they're going to compete for Senate control, but it really looks like they're on their way to doing that. The governor's race, however, though, in Ohio is much more competitive. Current Ohio Governor John Kasich, term limited, so this is an open seat, always attracts a lot of attention. The man that Sherrod Brown beat to get into the Senate in 2006, Republican Mike DeWine, Ohio's current Attorney General, well, he's in a numeric as well as a statistical tie with Democrat Richard Cordray, 44-44.
Yeah, those are what we call too close to call. But it's important, and we're going to talk about Arizona in a second, but these governor races are not just insignificant this time because of the fact that there will be the census and redistricting and all those things that are going to occur. So who has the governor's seat in these states is not just for the oath of office and whatever they normally do. It's going to have a whole bunch to do with reapportionment and other incredibly important things.
And briefly, Arizona, there is a governor's race and a Senate race. Briefly, in the governor's race, the incumbent Doug Ducey is likely, he's way ahead. He's 10 points ahead, and there's not been a big race there. What's interesting is we're even bothering to poll in Arizona, which has traditionally for quite a while, at least on the Senate side, since Dennis DeConcini left office, has been a Republican stronghold. And Kyrsten Sinema is ahead 45-43 in the three-way race among likely voters in Arizona in our poll over Martha McSally. Martha McSally, you'll recall, we polled this earlier when it was a primary race, and she had some more conservative competition, and Democrats were really hoping that one of those two would win because it would have probably helped. But as it turns out, Kyrsten Sinema is running ahead. They're both sitting Congress people in Arizona, which has a pretty even split in Congress thanks to some redistricting reform in Arizona some time ago. So interesting stuff. Hey, you know who would be good to talk to about this?
Steve Kornacki, maybe.
Steve Kornacki. And you know what? He's right here.
Oh,
hi, Steve.
Good. Hi, Steve. Welcome.
Thank you. What do they say? Long-time listener, first-time
good.
participant.
Well, it's back to Marist. I should point out that Steve is going to obviously be doing the podcast that we're doing right now, but also in a little bit he's going to be talking to students at Marist about his new book and all things political. So welcome back to Marist, and this time you have a book, we have a podcast. It's a whole new world.
The red and the blue. Let's keep.
The red
Oh
and the
yes,
blue.
my publishers told me to mention the title at least 43 times.
Well, the funny thing about the red and the blue is, and I recognized this because we were all up that night. In fact, I was on TV that night, but I didn't remember it. It didn't come back to me why we call it the red and the blue. Why are Republicans red and Democrats blue? And you talk about this in the book.
Yeah,
why is that?
and
What happened?
Why don't you start with the last page?
It's amazing because it feels like it's been with us forever. The red states, the blue states, red America, blue America, and it basically came into being on election night 2000. And if you looked back a generation before that, when color television really had kind of became a thing.
Instead of the gray and the light gray.
Right. The networks, sometimes blue would be Republican, sometimes blue would be Democratic. There was no real consistent scheme. And of course, in the 80s, you had 3 lopsided elections, so it didn't matter. Reagan 49 states, Bush 40 in 1988. And it just so happened in election night 2000, every network had the same scheme, Democrats blue, Republicans red, and it was a cliffhanger. And the divide, it was so stark. It was, the Republicans, everything in the South, basically. The Democrats, so everything in the Northeast. The
nice
Pacific
graphics.
Coast.
Nice graphics.
And you get red and the blue became a thing.
On this topic, when we were sitting above the rink at 30 Rock in 2008, and they have the big map at NBC on the ice.
On the ice, yeah.
And I asked the students in class, how do they color the red and the blue? And everybody thinks that it's done somehow in the control room. But the truth, and this may be a secret I shouldn't be letting out, that the truth is that during commercial breaks, there's 2 guys walk out on the ice, and they have hoses.
Do they really?
And they have the little things like they use for the street.
It's not TV magic.
When they do parking lots. They have those kind of cardboard cutouts.
I had no idea.
And there's one guy with blue, and there's another guy with red. And depending on how the state goes, they spray the state, and then they walk off the ice, and that's how the high-tech world works.
So I want to know, election night 2000, I don't know. How did they uncolor Florida when they had to?
I don't recall. We weren't using the ice.
Right.
They were using it that way.
Good thing.
But there was a time, I think, that someone did Missouri wrong. I could be wrong on the state.
Yeah.
And I suspect, that's kind of like a real error, that unforced error on elections.
Right.
But anyway, let's get to
So actually, Missouri's another
Yeah.
state that we're talking about in the battlegrounds. Let's talk about these 3.
Yeah.
You are famous for digging in deep, looking at these numbers and then explaining it to people, which is always a challenge, right? How do you explain crosstabs and all these other things? And where is the meaning in these numbers? When you see Arizona, Florida, Ohio, which one of these do you want to start with? Which one really leaps off the page?
Well, yeah, and you guys, give us the material for it. So thank you. I'll start with Florida because I think Florida, your poll, this new poll you're talking about right here, is changing slightly but significantly the way I look at this race. And I think this is true for some other people I've talked to. Florida, a sense was taking hold over the summer that this was the biggest single positive surprise for Republicans. You looked at it and you said, okay, it's a Trump state, but Trump only won it by 2 points. In midterm environment where Trump's not that popular overall, you have a Democratic incumbent. okay, the Democrats should be safer. I think that was the sense going into the year, and the surprise over the summer was, wow, Rick Scott is stronger than we thought. He's become more popular in his second term there in Florida, particularly with Hispanic voters, Puerto Rican voters. He'd visited Puerto Rico a number of times over the last year. And I think there was a lot of reevaluation of Bill Nelson as a candidate, saying, well, he's been there 3 terms. And I think you guys I've talked about this in the past on your podcast. Has he really left much of a mark?
Yeah, barely anybody knows who he is.
Right.
After 3 terms.
Remember who his opponent was, but we're talking about the 2000 recount in Florida. In 2006, Catherine Harris, the controversial Secretary of State from 2000. That's who the Republicans put up against him in 2006. So I think there was a sense that, wow, this is a dead even race, and Scott's got a chance of pulling this off, and that's catastrophic for Democrats. I think what you're showing here is Nelson, it's a small lead, but Nelson is ahead in this race right now. And I think it's significant because if that holds in terms of the Senate math, that's a huge sigh of relief for Democrats.
So is that Andrew Gillum's coattails?
And that's
because Andrew Gillum, remind people who are listening, he was in 3rd or 4th place in the few polls that were done, scientific polls that were done in the primary over the summer. The final poll wasn't a great poll, but he was still in like 3rd or 4th place, and he won by 10 points. He won by a significant margin.
It was supposed to be Gwen Graham was supposed to be the Democratic candidate, or maybe Phil Levine from
So is this guy who came from behind, blew away the Democratic primary field, is really a powerful guy who's gotten a lot of attention? Is this kind of neophyte, this freshman guy, is it his coattails that are helping this 3-term incumbent senator?
Yeah, it's starting to look that. I was looking in, closer into the numbers you guys have there, and just the personal popularity numbers, and a couple things jumped out at me. Number one, yes, Gillum is more popular, has a better margin between his favorable, unfavorable than Nelson does. Also, Scott, not as personally popular as I thought he'd become. I'd seen some other numbers earlier that suggested maybe he was better positioned. And I think there's that theory, the theory that the Democrats who got behind Gillum in the primary, it's the same theory you're seeing in Georgia in the governor's race there. It's this expand the pie theory. The idea in the primary that, Gwen Graham, the former congresswoman from the Panhandle, was supposed to be that we thought was going to be the Democratic candidate. And Gwen Graham was going to run the kind of campaign we're used to seeing Democrats run in Florida. You run to the middle. You come from a Republican-friendly area, you bow to Republicans on a few issues, you say, hey, I'm a middle-of-the-road person, and you go for those sort of swing voters. And the Gillum theory, and we see this with Stacey Abrams in Georgia too, the Gillum theory is, no, we're going to get new voters into this. We're going to excite the Democratic base. We're going to grow the number of Democratic voters out there. And your poll is, every poll I've seen since the primary in that governor's race has put him ahead now. And yes, outperforming Nelson in every one. And yeah, I mean, if he won the governor's race by 4 and Nelson wins by 1, maybe that's the difference.
That's his thank you note. Can the Democrats win the majority in the Senate without keeping Nelson's seat?
I can't see it. I feel like if they lose Florida, and we'll see North Dakota. I look at North Dakota as the single most endangered Democratic seat. Heidi Heitkamp up there
with almost no real polling going on. But are you hearing from internals? I mean, clearly they've got it. But both candidates have enough money to be doing good internal polling.
No,
is that what you're hearing?
The indications you get, even Democrats just sort of when you have conversations sort of informally. I have not seen any hard numbers, but just the informal conversations, they talk about this one as this one looks
rough.
Indiana's tough. You always knew West Virginia's going to be tough for Democrats, although Manchin looks like he's holding his own right there.
And Donnelly in our polls.
Yes, you guys, you're polling on Indiana.
In Indiana, Donnelly.
If you lose North Dakota and you lose Florida for Democrats,
big trouble.
You got to win 3 of those Republican seats.
Nevada, Arizona,
and Tennessee.
Yeah,
right.
Let's talk about Ohio for a second. One of the areas, obviously, on election night in 2016 was how Donald Trump kind of cracked the blue wall in the industrial Midwest.
Right.
So he won places starting, I guess, with Pennsylvania, but up through Ohio and Michigan and all those places, Wisconsin. And now we're seeing in our numbers and in others that there's the industrial Midwest isn't kind of lining up the way the Republicans had wanted. Our Ohio numbers showing that it's, obviously governor being a little different there, but in the Senate, Wisconsin in the Senate, Democrats looking strong. So what are we seeing in this industrial
and in the governor's race in Wisconsin?
And the governor's race.
Yes, right. Yeah, the Democrats, what's their 8th shot at Scott Walker? They might actually get him this time around. No, I think, look, your Ohio poll, I think, confirms what the sense has been, and I think now it's pretty clear, absent some kind of shocking shakeup in that race. Sherrod Brown's in great shape there. Yeah. Ohio, I'm a little bit more surprised that the margin there than I am Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, because Trump won those states, obviously, but it was 77,000 votes, as we all know, across those three states. I look at those three Democratic incumbents in those states, and I feel for their long-term political survival, the best thing that ever happened to them was Donald Trump won in 2016, because it almost set those states up for what we normally see in midterm elections, where there's a move against the White House party. But Ohio was one, again, where the Trump margin was, what, it was about 10 points? High single digits, about 10 points in Ohio.
It was like
so
eight or 9 points.
It was between an 8 and 9.
I do wonder, does that speak to Sherrod Brown and some of the particular, because Sherrod Brown has always...
he's a very appealing Trump-esque kind of candidate, but he's a Democrat.
Right.
Shirt sleeves rolled up, messy hair. He talks
trade
plain
issues
spoken,
in particular.
Trade issues. He's a real blue. He's an old-style Midwestern Democrat. He's not a talking tech. He's not talking, finance and things like that. He's talking steel mills.
He does, and he stays away from a lot of the sort of the cultural hot buttons that I think you see a lot of the rest of the party going to. I saw an interview with him this week. It seems like every single Democrat in the country is looking to run in 2020. He sounds like he really isn't. Unless he's playing coy in a way that he thinks they'll end up coming around.
We're going to poll the people who are not running. It'll probably be easier than polling
I
the
think
people.
that's exactly.
We do have a limit. You can't do 35 candidates.
Well, we'll have to. It'll be like the
that'll be
Republicans in
another
16. We'll have
story.
that kids table debate. And,
Please,
we'll see who ends up at
please,
that.
not that again.
And
But
don't
anyway,
use the polls.
I just want to ask you about Arizona, because my second job in TV was in Arizona a long time ago.
Okay.
When John McCain's first term, Dennis Deaconsini was the
Oh,
senator.
yeah.
We had back and forth Democratic Republican governors. Janet Napolitano in the 2000s was a governor there. So we think of Arizona as being very Republican, but it has become a purple state, partly because of Latinos, partly because of the inflow of other voters. But are you surprised that Martha McSally and Kyrsten Sinema are this close, or even that Sinema's ahead?
At this point, I'm not, because it seems pretty consistent now. And I think if you look at those, I'd say 4 states where Democrats have some kind of shot of knocking off a Republican incumbent: Nevada, Arizona, Tennessee, Texas. We can throw in there. I think Arizona is clearly the top target for them to do that. The number in your poll that jumped out the most at me was the favorable, unfavorable.
Yeah.
Underwater, Martha McSally.
Yeah.
And maybe you guys, is that residual
From the primary?
Probably from
Because
the primary.
she was
So messy.
right. And I know you guys have talked about this, but it was it's that primary where on paper lopsided, but there's a bigger split in that Republican Party than that.
The other one too is the approval, disapproval of Donald Trump. Remember, we didn't say this. Everything we were talking about is likely voters. So we're actually in the likely voter
Right.
screen. So we're not talking about the people who are most likely to vote. 51 disapprove to 44 approve in Arizona. That's the same as in Ohio that we're finding among likely voters. That's a 7-point split in Arizona,
Arizona-
to disapprove the president. That's the same as Ohio. I don't think of Ohio and Arizona being, they're alike in that. But they are.
But in 2016, Trump only won Ohio by about 4 points.
Arizona.
Arizona.
Oh, yeah, no, it
Arizona
was
by
close.
4 points.
I get it.
So it was very close. So if you have a Hillary Clinton as a candidate coming within 4 points of winning Arizona in the presidential race, I think the Senate becomes very, very competitive.
Hillary Clinton went there, I think, in the last weekend or close to election day.
Well, that's when they were thinking, which
run up
are
the
we going
score.
we can win Georgia and Texas.
expand the map instead
So,
of
okay.
right.
Yeah, that didn't work
I don't
out.
know if it's not really switching gears exactly, because it's very much what we're talking about. We're sort of now living the political tribalism that you write about in The Red and the Blue, the 1990s, and the birth of political tribalism. I read it, and I was thankfully asked or gratefully asked to be one of your reviewers for it, and so I found it really interesting for a lot of reasons, which we've talked about in part because the course that we did on 1968 was in many ways a time of my coming of age, just like this was for you. But let's talk about political tribalism. I mean, you're talking about this period of Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton and polarization and names who've reappeared, even Donald Trump with a cameo appearance in 2000.
Absolutely.
So talk about, what you picked out of the 1990s that you feel is very much real today.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and this is in the title, and we were talking about this a few minutes ago, it is the decade that red and blue came to mean something. And what it really was the decade when people in this country chose sides. And we talk about in political science. You talk about ticket splitting. Folks who vote for the Democrat for president, the Republican for Congress, and that long term, that is something, as you guys know, that's been shrinking. But really, in the '90s, you had this syncing up of demographic characteristics, geographic characteristics, cultural characteristics, that by the end of the decade, there were just these very, very, very deep divisions between somebody who would vote for a Republican and somebody who would vote for a Democrat. And it resulted in that almost perfect tie in the year 2000. Yeah. And that basic divide, there have been changes. The Democrats are now making some inroads in the South because of some migration patterns, because of metro areas, that sort of thing. There have been some changes, but that basic scheme that was locked in on election night 2000, we're still living in, red and the blue. And I think when you look at what the Republican Party kind of became in the 1990s and what it is today, the person I use to tell that story is Newt Gingrich.
Yeah, of course.
Because I think, it's you got to go back, of course, to 78, which is when Gingrich comes to Congress. But what Gingrich really did was, he comes to Congress in 1978 as a gadfly,
yes,
an untenured professor from West Georgia College who's making his third bid for Congress. If he loses, he's going to be a perennial candidate in West Georgia, and no one's ever going to hear of him. But he gets in there, and he comes to the House, and for that point, it's been a quarter of a century. The Democrats have been the majority party. He tells Republicans, "I'm going to lead you to the majority." And Dick Cheney, who's in Congress at the time, calls him a pest and an irritant and all these, and they totally ignored him. And what he understood, and that Republicans at that point didn't, because that Republican Party had liberals, it had moderates, it was very, very different. He understood the power of populism. He understood the power of sort of positioning yourself in hostile opposition to the idea of elites in liberal culture, elites in the media. And he also found, he recognized, it's a forerunner to cable news that we have today. He recognized in C-SPAN the opportunity to bypass the traditional media and connect with a grassroots audience. In C-SPAN, they did just going live with, wall-to-wall coverage of Congress. And so they started using these, he had like 6 allies in the early 80s, started using these late-night speeches when the House is empty, but the camera's got to broadcast them. Mm-hmm. And they were basically producing like what would now look like a show on Fox News. Yeah. And they're bashing the Democrats. And there's this one night, they called out 10 Democrats by name, including one of them was the best friend of House Speaker Tip O'Neill at the time. And they basically accused him of treason on the House floor. And because the camera's trained on them and you can't see the well of the House, it looks like they're challenging them to step forward and defend themselves, and they won't. O'Neill finds out about it. He gets furious. It turns into this scene where Gingrich ends up having to address the House. 10 a.m., full session. O'Neill comes in, is standing at the front of the chamber with the gavel, and he says, "I'm going to yield to the gentleman from Georgia now because I'm very interested to hear what he has to say." And then O'Neill says, "I'm going to go sit on the floor with my members." So he goes down there, and he doesn't know what he's walking into. Gingrich then, in classic Gingrich form, goes on and on for 20 minutes. Just, I'm a student of history, world historical forces. This is a McCarthyism of the left. And O'Neill just boils over, and he can't take it. And he finally interrupts, "Will the gentleman yield? Will the gentleman yield?" And Gingrich, he knows, "I'd be delighted to yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts who I always learn something from." And O'Neill, his hand is shaking, and he says, "I just want you to know that what you did is the lowest thing I've ever seen anyone do in this House in 32 years. And there's gasps, because he has just directly attacked another member. And Trent Lott, who's standing right behind Gingrich, recognizes a rule's been broken. They go to the parliamentarian. The parliamentarian's a Democratic appointee. They spend 15 minutes trying to figure out how they can not rule against O'Neill. They come back. They order his words be taken down. Never happened to a House Speaker before. And when the hour is over, Gingrich folds up his papers, walks up the aisle, and the entire Republican side rises. And I just think that was a turning point.
Wow.
Because they said, what, this stuff works, and it feels good. That's what the Republicans were saying.
Good.
So was that the beginning of alternative facts?
It was the beginning of alternative media universes. That's the way I look at it. Newt Gingrich, maybe this was by necessity, maybe it was just by some kind of strategic savvy on his part, but he recognized back then that as a 2 or 3 term member from Georgia, he's not calling up CBS, NBC, ABC and getting any airtime from them. So he's got to find a different way to get his voice out there. And he recognized through C-SPAN, here is an unfiltered sort of platform that anybody scanning the cable dial late at night can stumble on this, start listening to me, hear my message. There's no news anchor to say, actually this or actually that. There's no reporter to say, sir, actually, to follow up or anything. It's pure, unfiltered. And it was, conservative talk radio became a thing years after that, but it wasn't yet a big thing.
Yeah, that was after the fairness doctrine had to be repealed.
87, right, was the repeal.
Right.
This is 82, 83.
A few months later, Rush Limbaugh starts. But until then, you had to have equal time, so he wouldn't have been able to be on radio.
And
so this was perfect.
And then there's this syncing up. This is the sort of the rise of Gingrich told in the book, and the rise of the modern Republican Party. Gingrich makes his name through C-SPAN and through the kinds of sort of guerrilla attacks on the House floor I'm talking about. The fairness doctrine gets repealed in 87, so now national conservative talk radio can become a thing. Rush Limbaugh gets his show in the summer of 1988 and instantly gets millions of listeners, and 2 years later, it's an inside-outside game. Newt Gingrich on Capitol Hill. He's worked his way into Republican leadership. Limbaugh, like 10, 20 million listeners a week on his radio station, on his radio network. George H.W. Bush, Republican president, cuts a deal with the Democrats to go back on his read my lips, no new taxes pledge. And Limbaugh is calling him a traitor on the airwaves, and Gingrich leads the revolt in the House, and the Republicans kill it. They kill the Bush deal. Bush, and it's a hugely embarrassing moment, October 1990. And Bush, politically, probably never recovered from that.
One of the things I was also struck by in the book, and these are great stories about the time, takes us
and very
back.
colorful,
very colorful, as we expected.
Red and
colorful character.
Pat Buchanan becomes a important figure to this period. And when I was reading in the book, in your book, I mean, there's lines that Pat Buchanan said when he was running for president that sound eerily very contemporary, like, I'm going to make America great again.
Yep.
And America first, and things that are very much Trumpian in nature, long before Donald Trump was even took a brief scene into politics in 2000.
Right.
But so talk about Pat Buchanan, because to me he's an important figure in this. In a national way, in a Republican Party presidential way, that I see parts of today.
Oh yeah, here's
and
another
also
line.
challenging the president.
Yeah.
And build that wall. That was Buchanan ran on the border wall.
Oh, that's right.
Buchanan was the first major national politician to say, I want a wall on the entire southern border. And the Buchanan story quickly was just, in 92, because of Bush breaking the Read My Lips pledge, Buchanan challenges him in the primary. And, he did very well in the primaries, 37% in New Hampshire.
And he got that speaking spot at the convention.
At the convention,
where he blew
right.
the convention up because of how well he had done. They had to give him that spot.
And it was initially interpreted as just basically a blowback, basically Republicans upset about the tax hike. And so they gave him a convention speaking spot in the summer of 92, thinking he'll unify the party, he'll say, and he gives what's called the culture war speech.
Yes.
And it went so much farther than, and you just hear these very conservative cultural themes. Then he runs again in 96, an open Republican nomination, and everybody thinks, Bob Dole's the front runner, and the big conservative challenger to Dole is going to be Phil Gramm from Texas, who starts out the campaign saying, I have the best friend any politician can have, easy money. That's my southern accent. It's terrible.
For a guy from Boston, you're pushing
It's as good as it gets. Yeah, I shouldn't have even tried that. And Buchanan, everybody thinks Buchanan, he was a protest candidate in 92 notes. So Buchanan in 96 runs on. Now, in the first Clinton term, you've had NAFTA passed. You've had GATT, General Agreement on Trade, a lot of international trade deals. Buchanan runs on them as a sellout of the American worker. He runs on the border wall. He runs against multiculturalism in our schools, the disappearance of European American culture. He runs on hard hat Pat. That's the kind of message. Pitchfork Pat is what they were calling him back then. And he wins the New Hampshire primary. There's this 2-week period in early 96. He starts out, he goes up to Alaska, and he basically picks a fight with Phil Gramm. They're having Alaska caucuses, and nobody's covering it, but because Buchanan picks a fight, the media covers it. Buchanan wins. He calls himself King of the Klondike. And then he says, now we go and we'll fight. Buchanan was very colorful. He's a speechwriter, right?
Yeah.
He says, now we're going to go fight the Battle of the Bayou. They go down to Louisiana. He destroys Gramm there in the caucuses.
So he was the first with alliteration also,
yes, and
like
he
Donald
knew
Trump did.
Branding. He knew branding. And Trump's a little different with it. Nearly wins Iowa, beats Dole in New Hampshire. Bernie Shaw is on CNN that night. They get the alert. He says, a political tsunami has just hit the Republican Party. Pat Buchanan has won the New Hampshire primary. Eventually, the Republicans, they coalesce around Dole. They keep Buchanan from the nomination. He bolts the party 4 years later in the run to 2000. He says they are rigging the Republican nomination.
Yeah, and he took over the Reform Party.
Right. So
I
George
went
W.
to that
Bush,
convention in Long Beach, and
Long
he
Beach,
ran
California.
with with an African American
Isola
woman from
Foster.
There you go. Yeah, and I remember walking to this with all the media. We were walking across one of the boulevards there, and we go into this convention center in Long Beach because it was a week before the Democratic convention at the Staples Center, and I was like, "What the heck is this guy doing?" It was a circus.
Well, and this was the remnants of, remember, Ross Perot had run twice, 92, he was very successful, 96, not so much, but it had created a framework for a third party. So going into 2000, the Reform Party, the nominee was eligible for $12.5 million, which back then was real money for a candidate. So Buchanan said they're rigging the Republican nomination for George W. Bush. I'm out. I'm going Reform Party. And their Perot voters, there was a lot of overlap with Buchanan issues. So who steps forward to challenge Buchanan for the nomination? Donald J. Trump. But the amazing thing is...
Wake me up. Hold on a second.
Yeah,
this can't be
no,
real.
That's
real.
right.
And the amazing thing is, everything that Buchanan's running on is the border, border wall, trade protections, and we've gotten screwed in these trade deals, all that stuff. Trump calls him a Nazi lover, a racist. He says Trump makes a campaign swing to Southern California to something called the Museum of Tolerance, which the Simon Wiesenthal Center runs out in Law. He takes a tour of the Museum of Tolerance. He goes outside to the cameras and he says, "I really wish Pat Buchanan would come and see this place because it would teach him something." He is running against the Trump, as we now know it, of 1999-2000. And David Duke went and endorsed Pat Buchanan for the Reform Party nomination, and Donald Trump puts an op-ed in the New York Times. The New York Times publishes an op-ed from Donald Trump in which Donald Trump says, "You know what? I'm done with the Reform Party. I cannot associate myself with a political party that will not distance itself from David Duke."
Who later he says he doesn't know who
And
it
I
is.
say it is.
Well, he was obviously taking some notes about how to win.
Yeah.
Well, there's been some
primary.
and there's been some very interesting reporting. Tim Alberta is his name, from Politico magazine, about a year ago. He said that sometime, I think it was about 2010, somewhere around then, Donald Trump, out of the blue, called Pat Buchanan up and said, he apologized. He said, "Pat, I'm sorry. You were right."
Wow.
And in the post-Bush America of 2016, the country made red and blue by the 90s, Donald Trump steps forward, runs on the Buchanan platform, and here we are.
And Bernie Shaw was right when he called it a tsunami for the Republican Party that day in New Hampshire. It was just a very delayed tsunami.
To about 2 decades later.
But he was right.
And Pat Buchanan, this interview I'm talking about with Tim Alberta, he said the morning after the 2016 election, he said it was the first time in years he woke up feeling optimistic about America.
Okay.
Donald Trump won.
Now, Steve, before we wrap, I mean, you are well known for your visualization of American politics on the board and all this. You also have this pose with thumbs in your front pocket and kind of and I would be remiss because you have a significant audience, but they don't get a chance to ask the question. Okay. Where does that come from?
I don't know where to put my hands. I used to what did I do? When they in soccer, when there's a free kick and they form a wall.
Yes.
I used to kind of hold my hands there like the soccer players do, like kind of, and one of the higher ups at NBC, Iowa Caucuses 2016, pulls me aside and he's like, "Yeah, don't do that." So I'm like, "Okay, so what do I do?" So I put it in my pockets, it's too casual.
Yeah.
So I put like a thumb in.
Yeah, it's
I don't know what else to do. Do I cross my arms?
No,
Then I look
Well,
like,
it's your signature now.
Okay.
Okay. So one other question. Do you drink a lot of coffee?
This is it's Diet Coke.
Everybody asked you, but
I'm not a coffee drinker, but it's Diet Coke. I get plenty of caffeine.
All right.
So yeah.
I'm just curious because I didn't drink coffee until near the end of my career in TV, and everybody thought I was a little hyperkinetic, and I never drank coffee. I couldn't. It woke me up all night, especially those trips to on the campaign events where you're doing a late hit, you're doing the Today Show hit and all that.
Yes.
So you're only getting 4 hours sleep, but coffee would keep me up all night, so I'd never sleep. And I only started drinking coffee after I left TV. So I just wanted to figure out what your secret was.
I haven't acquired the taste for it yet. No, honestly, it's just there's something about election nights. The numbers start coming in.
It's adrenaline, baby.
It really is.
That's it. That's why we do all this.
Exactly. Yeah.
But so the book is called The Red and the Blue, and I've got it right here. This is an advance copy, but you can get it on Tuesday. Is that right?
October 2nd, out
at
in
bookstores, Amazon. Is there going to be an audiobook of this?
There is.
Are you reading it?
I read the prologue and the acknowledgments, and there was the estimate of how long it was going to take me to read it was impractical. I showed up to read the prologue, and she said, "You know what? This actually would have only taken 2 days." So, and then they tell me it's like a big part of the sales.
Audiobooks, you can go to time and a half or double speed, so you can get through it faster. With him,
Yeah,
there's
you
no
wouldn't
double
have
speed.
to do it,
would just
yeah.
be normal.
I think it's about 20 minutes. 400 pages
Right.
and about 30 pages.
not
No,
sure
but
it's intelligible,
it is a fun read and an exciting read.
Thank you.
And thank you for the book, and thank you for coming to Marist
no, thanks
in
for having us.
advance
This
for our
is-
students who are going to have a great time tonight.
This was a ton of fun. Thank you.
And that will do it for this edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York, with Mary Griffith sitting right to my right, who's our executive producer, and Kenny Marples, who's our editor down on the other end. And we will require no edits on this, or we a few? A few. Okay.
We'd also like to thank the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University, who provides us with the ability to look back in time at survey questions and results over the decades.
That's how we can pull up the Pat Buchanan numbers from New Hampshire, see how he's doing in the poll right before he won. That'd be interesting to check out. Anyway, send your questions to pollhub at marist.edu. You can reach out to us on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Facebook. We're on Twitter and Instagram as well. And as always, there's a button on the device you're listening to this podcast on, and it says subscribe. Tap it. Do us a favor. Tap it. That way the next episode when it comes out will be in your queue, and you can find out the latest information about polls right here on Poll Hub. Have a good one, everybody.